Good morning, everyone. I hope you're well. Welcome to this legal update webinar for environmental and occupational health and safety legislation by the compliance people. So a little bit about me. My name is Tom Marsh and I'm an internal consultant from the compliance people. I have over 3 years experience working with the Legislation Update Service, updating it with new pieces of law and amendments to current legislation. I have also conducted internal audits of health and safety, environmental and quality management systems against the ISO standards. In the first part of the webinar, we'll be focusing on the environmental side of things. I've focused on some key changes that have happened since our last webinar back in February, and have focused on pieces that will be relevant to a wide range of organisations. Firstly, we'll be looking at the deposit and return scheme for Scotland. Then, we will look at the coming extended producer responsibility regime. We will revisit the plastic packaging tax and some of the changes that have been made to it. We'll look at the upcoming changes to waste exemptions, and lastly, we'll look at the EU Revocation Act. Firstly, we're going to be looking at the Deposit and Return Schemes Scotland Amendment Regulations 2023. These regulations only apply to Scotland and make changes to the Deposit and Return Scheme for Scotland Regulations 2020 that introduced a deposit and return scheme for single-use drink containers in Scotland. The 2020 regulations provide duties for producers and retailers of these single-use drink containers. For more details on the scope and duties of these regulations, you can watch the February webinar where we went into more detail, but essentially it is a scheme where the customer pays a 20 pence deposit when buying a drink in a single-use container, and they get that money back when they return the container to a designated location, known in the regulations as a return point. The scheme was originally intended to start in July 2022. It was then delayed until August 2023, as outlined in our previous webinar. The start of the scheme has now been delayed again by this amendment that we're talking about now, and it will begin on the 1st of March 2024. In addition to this delay to the start date, the amendment also makes a few other changes to the Deposit and Return Scheme for Scotland Regulations 2020. So some of the changes are to low volume drink products. If you're making or selling drink products with fewer than 5,000 units sold per year in Scotland, you must now be listed or registered with the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. You must also inform the purchaser of the product that it's not eligible under the return scheme. The date when producers must have applied for producer registration by has also been extended until the 12th of January 2024, or within 28 days from becoming a producer. This is to reflect the delay in the start date of the scheme. In subsequent years, applications must be made before the 1st of March each year. Now we'll go into some of the changes that have been made to return points. If 90% of a retailer's single-use drink containers are sold for consumption on the premises, then they do not need to operate a return point. Return points will also now be allowed to reject particular materials if accepting that material would put them in breach of their legal obligations relating to food safety or health and safety. But they must display signage explaining which materials they will not be accepting. If you are a retailer that sells single-use drinks containers exclusively for the purpose of being consumed on the premises of the sale, you must retain its packaging for collection by a producer or scheme administrator who themselves have obligations to collect that packaging. Finally, collection targets have been updated. These are the minimum percentage of items put onto the market that a producer must collect back under the return scheme. The collection target percentages themselves remain unchanged, but the dates are pushed back a year to align with the delay to the scheme's introduction. These targets are now 80% of scheme articles for the first full year of the scheme, and then 90% from the 1st of January 2026. We will now go over the extended producer responsibility. The extended producer responsibility is a new UK environmental policy that will replace the current packaging waste regulations. It puts the full cost of dealing with waste on the producers of the waste, from when it is placed on the market until its final disposal. It will be introduced in stages starting this year with the introduction of the data reporting regulations. Separate regulations on data reporting were published for England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland in the first half of 2023. The data reporting regulations require producers of packaging waste to collect data on their packaging from March of 2023. We will go into more detail on how to comply with the data reporting regulations on the following slide, but this data will be used to calculate the fees that will then need to be paid by producers of packaging waste when the extended producer responsibility is fully implemented. In July of this year, the government announced that the date from which fees under the extended producer responsibility would need to start being paid was delayed by 1 year, from the old date of October 2024 to October 2025. So as it stands, fees will need to be paid from October 2025. But the data reporting requirements are still in place this year. They were not revoked, so we will still need to report on our packaging. We're going to have a look at some of the key steps for compliance with the current data recording and reporting requirements, which form part of the extended producer responsibility. Remember, no fees have to be paid until 2025, but these data requirements are already in place and need to be followed. So firstly, you need to check if you need to take action. The extended producer responsibility regime will apply to all UK organisations that import or supply packaging. You need to collect and report packaging data if you are an individual business, subsidiary, or a group with an annual turnover of £1 million or more, and you were responsible for more than 25 tonnes of packaging in 2022. You also need to check if you are a large or small organisation, as this will determine how often you need to submit your data. What kind of organisation you are is based on your annual turnover and how much packaging you supply or import per year. You are classified as a small organisation if you have an annual turnover of between £1 and £2 million and are responsible for supplying or importing more than 25 tonnes of empty packaging or packaged goods into the UK. Or your annual turnover is over £1 million and you're responsible for importing between 25 and 50 tonnes of empty packaging or packaged goods into the UK. You are classed as a large organisation if you have an annual turnover of £2 million or more, or you're responsible for supplying or importing more than 50 tonnes of empty packaging or packaged goods into the UK. The next step is to collect data on your packaging. You need to collect data on your packaging you have supplied through the UK market or imported into the UK. The data that you need to collect is as follows: how you supplied the packaging, the type of packaging you produced, the packaging class, so is it primary, secondary, shipment, or tertiary packaging, and the packaging material and its weight. If you have this data from the start of the year, so January 2023, then you should report data for the entire year. If you do not have the required data to do this, then you must report the data from the 1st of March 2023. And then we have the final step, submitting your data. When to submit your data will depend on the size of your organisation. If you're a small organisation, then you will need to submit your data once per year. The deadline for submitting 2023's data is the 1st of April 2024. If you're a large organisation, then you'll need to submit data every 6 months. The deadlines for the submission of this year for large organisations are the 1st of October 2023 for the first half of the year, that's January to June. For the second half of the year, that's July to December, the submission deadline is the 1st of April 2024. Remember that even though the paying of the fees have been delayed to 2025, packaging data that will eventually be used to calculate those fees still need to be collected and submitted in 2023 and 2024. The data must be submitted in a file using the Report Packaging Data Service. More details on how to create a file with the correct data in and how to submit it can be found in the published government guidance. The Plastic Packaging Tax General Regulations 2022. These regulations were included in the previous webinar. It's a significant piece of environmental law, and there has been a change made in relation to claiming tax credits. The regulation applies to you if you manufacture or import plastic packaging into the UK. The tax itself applies to plastic packaging that contains less than 30% recycled plastic. It applies in the UK. It came into force in April 2022 and was introduced to encourage the use of recycled plastics rather than new plastics. Even if you are not required to pay the tax due to using a high percentage of recycled plastics in your packaging, there are still record-keeping duties within the regulations to be aware of. There are 5 key steps to complying with these regulations that we went over in more detail in the previous webinar. As these regulations are likely to affect a large number of organisations, I will quickly run through these key steps now. They are: step 1 is to determine if your packaging is in scope. These regulations apply to packaging that is used in any part of the supply chain and for single use by the consumer. Exemptions include packaging for human medicine and transport packaging to import multiple goods safely into the UK. Step 2, calculating the weight of packaging. There are a few methods that you can use, including the sample component method or the verified specification method. There is more detail on these methods and others that you can use in the published guidance. Step 3 is registering for your tax. You have to register for the tax if you manufacture or import 10 tonnes or more of plastic packaging. This is regardless of if you hit the 30% threshold and don't actually have to pay the tax. You can register as a group if you are part of one. Step 4, as stated before, there are a range of duties on keeping records even if you are not paying the tax. Here are some examples of records that must be kept. You are required to keep records of the calculations made in determining the weights of packaging in step 2, on the amount of packaging you are manufacturing or importing, on how much tax you are liable to pay, on if you have any exempt packaging, etc. More information on record keeping can be found in the official guidance. Then step 5, you must pay the tax that you are liable for. An amendment has come out since we last covered these regulations in our February webinar. This amendment changed the way in which tax credits are claimed under the plastic packaging tax from the 1st of July this year. Tax credits are available to those who have already paid tax for their packaging, but then either export or convert the packaging into a new component. From the 1st of July this year, organisations can claim tax credits in the same accounting period as the tax was paid. Before this amendment, it was set up so that it could only be claimed in the following accounting period. So before I continue, I just wanted to provide you with a quick reminder of where you can find our previous webinars and resources, as I've mentioned them a couple of times now. From our website, simply hover over the resources link in the top menu and select webinars and guides. Alternatively, the link that is on your screen now can also take you there. Here you will find lots of handy resources and copies of previous webinars that you can watch. Now, let's get back to today's webinar. Next, we're going to take a look at waste exemptions. There are changes coming to waste exemptions in England. If you are currently operating a waste activity under an exemption, then these changes will be relevant to you. We presented a webinar entirely on the coming changes to waste exemptions in July of this year, which is available on our website or on our YouTube channel. Here, I'll be giving an overview of these changes, but if you would like more detail, then it's well worth watching that webinar. DEFRA has published the details of the coming changes to the regime in the supplementary government responses and annexes. The changes include certain waste exemptions being changed or removed, and we will look at this in more detail on the next slide. And it introduces monetary charges for registering waste exemptions. A public consultation on these proposed charges will be available in autumn of this year. The changes outlined in the supplementary government response and annexes are expected to take effect from April 2024. This date is the current government estimate, so keep an eye out for any changes. Some waste exemptions will be removed completely, while some will have their conditions changed. Some will also have their titles changed, so this is something to also be aware of. If a waste exemption you currently operate under is removed, you will need to obtain an environmental permit for that activity, or else stop that activity completely. Waste exemptions will also be prohibited from being registered if there is a direct link to an existing environmental permit. Transitional periods will be allowed for each waste exemption to allow operators to adjust. During this period, changes must be made to the activities to ensure compliance. Operators will need to either obtain an environmental permit, change their activities, or stop the activity entirely. Requirements are also introduced to maintain general electronic records on your waste exemptions. Here is a list of the waste exemptions being changed and those being removed. For more information on each individual one, you can watch our webinar on the subject and read the documentation published by DEFRA. Here, we have some steps that you can take to prepare for the changes to waste exemptions. Firstly, review the current waste exemptions. Are any ones relevant to you due to be changed or removed? Secondly, take note of the consultation on registration charges coming in autumn of 2023. And thirdly, read the supplementary government response and annexes. This contains a huge amount of information on the coming changes. Next, we are quickly going to look at the retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Act 2023. The European Union Withdrawal Act 2018 retains many EU laws in UK law to ensure that the UK's legal system continued to function properly as it moved away from the EU. This act, the retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Act 2023, is introduced to enable the amendment of retained EU law and to remove the special features it has in the UK legal system. It revokes nearly 600 pieces of EU law in a process known as the sunsetting of EU legislation, and it assimilates the remaining retained EU law at the end of 2023. This assimilation removes the special features that retained EU law has attached to it. These special features include the removal of the principle of supremacy of EU law from UK law by the end of 2023. The principle of supremacy of EU law requires domestic law give way to EU law when they are found to be inconsistent with one another. This is the case for retained EU law until it is assimilated by this Act at the end of this year. When these pieces of retained EU law are assimilated into UK law, you might notice some changes on lists to the titles of legislation. There is also the possibility for some changes to duties of pieces of legislation, depending on what amendments the UK government make. So be aware that these changes are coming at the end of the year. We will keep you updated on the changes as we make them to the system in response to this Act. Now we will move on to changes to health and safety legislation. We will be looking at the restriction of hazardous substances regulations, changes to REACH, changes on how dangerous chemicals are classified and labelled in the EU, the introduction of new legislation on the control of explosive precursors and poisons, and changes to the Building Safety Act and Building Scotland regulations. First, we will have a look at the changes that have been made to the restriction of the use of certain hazardous substances in electrical and electronic equipment regulations 2012. Under these regulations, manufacturers, importers and distributors of electrical and electronic equipment are required to limit the use of certain hazardous substances and require equipment to be conformity marked before being placed on the market. The changes that have been made to these regulations are made with the intention of phasing out new fluorescent lamps, broadly in line with action being taken in the EU, albeit on a different timescale. Currently, there are exemptions in place that allow manufacturers, importers, and distributors to exceed mercury levels for certain products, which are currently set at 0.1% concentration by overall weight of electrical and electronic equipment. These exemptions are what allow for the continued supply of fluorescent lamps into the market, which contain relatively high levels of mercury. These exemptions include one that allow the manufacture of T2, T5, T8 and T12 lamps, but these are expiring on the 1st of February 2024. While this is not a ban on the use of these fluorescent lamps, the removal of these exemptions will prevent new products of this type entering the market, resulting in them gradually being phased out as their supply becomes increasingly scarce. Those still using fluorescent lamps might benefit by converting their lighting to a more modern alternative, such as the more energy efficient LED lighting. If you'd like more information on the expiry dates of the exemptions under these regulations, then the government guidance has them all listed. Next, we'll be looking at changes to UK REACH, specifically changes to the registration and submission deadlines. Under the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, EU REACH was brought into UK law in 2021 and is known as UK REACH. Registrations and authorisations granted under the EU regime were automatically transferred into the domestic regime, with a requirement for the registrants to provide the HSE with an initial notification, followed by a technical dossier and a chemical safety report where required. GB-based manufacturers and suppliers are also required to register each chemical substance they manufacture or import into Great Britain, that is of 1 tonne or more per year. As covered in our previous Legal Update webinar, a range of complex transitional arrangements for GB-based operations are in place for those which had registered chemicals with the European Chemical Agency under EU REACH. An extension has been granted due to concerns over the cost and time it would take to collect the required data to comply with the transitional provisions. These concerns have remained, and as a result, the deadlines have been extended by a further 3 years to October 2026, October 2028, and October 2030. Now we will take a look at these dates in a bit more detail on the next slide. So October 2026 is the new registration deadline for substances included on the EU REACH candidate list before UK REACH came into effect on the 31st of December 2020. October 2028 is the new registration deadline for substances added to the UK REACH candidate list before the above 2026 submission deadline, and for all substances manufactured or imported in quantities of 100 tonnes or more per year. And October 2023 is the new registration deadline for all substances manufactured in Great Britain or imported in quantities of 1 tonne or more per year. These extensions should allow the government to develop a new registration model for UK REACH. It is expected that it will take until late 2024 to develop and legislate for the new model for transitional REACH registrations. So in April, changes were made to the way dangerous chemicals are classified in the EU. Changes are specifically made to the EU version and not the GB retained version, so these changes are only relevant to the EU. The changes are made to introduce new ways to identify chemicals that have the potential to harm the environment. This could be due to their toxicity, ability to persist within the environment for long periods of time, or how easily they can move within an environment. This can include high levels of bioaccumulation, where a substance can become increasingly concentrated higher up within a food chain. New criteria for classifying and labeling of substances and mixtures with the following properties are introduced. Those that are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. Those that are very persistent and very bioaccumulative. Those that are persistent, mobile, and toxic. Those that are very persistent and very mobile. Those that have endocrine disrupting properties. These are chemicals that can interfere with hormones in humans or animals. A requirement is also introduced to identify chemicals that are classified that are classed as endocrine disruptors. New criteria for classifying and labeling substances and mixtures with these properties are introduced from the 1st of May 2025, and then additional criteria from the 1st of May 2026. The specifics of these new criteria are too expansive to go into detail on here. If you would like to read the details for specific properties that may apply to you, you can find links to all of them on the Legislation Update service. These include things such as certain concentration limits and evidence of adverse effects in organisms or their offspring. If any of these properties could be relevant to you, then it's worth looking into and ensuring that you are ready for the new classification and labelling requirements. Next, we'll look at a new piece of legislation that strengthens existing safeguards that are in place to prevent the unlawful use of certain explosive precursors and poisons. These regulations were introduced as a result of the 2017 Manchester terrorist attacks and come into force from the 1st of October 2023. They apply to Great Britain and work alongside the Control of Poisons and Explosive Precursor Regulations 2015, which remain in force. Organisations, including online marketplaces, that sell or supply regulated or reportable substances must now notify potential customers that the product that they are buying is a regulated or reportable substance. These organisations must also report any suspicious transactions, significant losses, or thefts to the telephone number set up by the Secretary of State within 24 hours of the event. It is also now a requirement to make a note of the customer's name, address, business name where applicable, nature of the trade, and the customer's VAT number also where applicable. A copy of a photographic identification must also be taken, and all this information must be kept for a period of 18 months. Exemptions to this are made when a previous record has been made within 18 months of the most recent purchase. There is also a new requirement for organisations who employ workers to make supplies of regulated or reportable substances to make those workers aware of the relevant information and requirements for its sale. Now we're going to look at updates to the Building Safety Act 2022. It was made in response to the Grenfell Tower fire and gives residents and homeowners more rights, powers, and protections. It puts building safety as a priority throughout the life cycle of a building. Some additional changes have been made since our webinar in February that I will outline here. So we have costs of historical safety remediation. Landlords must not pass on any costs for historical safety remediation to leaseholders if the relevant landlord is part of a landlord group that exceeds a net worth of £2 million. We have defining of higher risk buildings. In order to confirm if a building falls under the higher risk building category, it is clarified that the height of a building is to be measured from the ground level to the top of the floor surface of the top story. Now, this is an important clarification as it will help determine which buildings fall under this Act. And we have registration of higher risk buildings. The principal accountable person under the Act for buildings must register their higher risk building with a building safety regulator before it is occupied by any residents. Failure to do this will be a criminal offence from the 1st of October 2023. While on the subject of building regulations, I will go over changes to the Building Scotland Regulations 2004. These regulations affect new buildings and certain building conversion works in Scotland. Changes have been made by the Building Scotland Amendment Regulations 2023 and will come into force on the 1st of April 2024. New domestic and non-domestic buildings completed after the 1st of April 2024 date are no longer allowed to be heated or cooled using direct emissions heating systems, such as gas boilers. Instead, more environmentally friendly alternatives such as heat networks or heat pumps must be used. The Scottish Government have committed to introducing a legislative framework that will prohibit the use of direct emissions heating systems in all homes by 2045. But this new amendment that we have here will only prohibit the installation of them for new buildings. So there's no requirement to take them out of old buildings. Only buildings completed after April 2024 are affected, unless it starts before April 2024 and finishes before the 1st of July 2024, in which case the restrictions of this amendment will also apply. The ban on the use of direct emissions heating systems also excludes emergency heating or heating solely for the purpose of frost protection. So those two ones are excluded from the requirements. Finally, we're going to be looking forward at a few of the things that we are expecting to see in the coming months and years. These are changes that are being looked at to be made or recent consultations that could be of interest. Firstly, there is the plastic packaging tax. This one relates to the Plastic Packaging Tax General Regulations 2022, which we have already covered in this webinar. There is currently a consultation on a mass balance approach to determining the amount of chemically recycled plastic in a plastic packaging's components. A mass balance approach tracks material through complex value chains, enabling recycled or sustainable inputs that are mixed with newer materials to be allocated to particular outputs. This might be relevant to you if you manufacture or import plastic packaging in the UK. The consultation is specifically asking for opinions on if a mass balance approach should be an accepted way of allocating recycled plastic content to packaging, and the controls that would need to be introduced around this. Next, we have the ban on single-use plastics. From the 1st of October 2023, businesses will no longer be allowed to supply, sell, or offer certain single-use plastic items in England. We did mention this on our last webinar on the Horizon section, but the contents of the legislation itself has been released since then. So we know a bit more about the specifics of what it will entail when the ban comes into force. The title of this legislation, which is currently in draft, is the Environmental Protection, Plastic Plates, etc. and Polystyrene Containers, etc. England Regulations 2023. It bans single-use plates, bowls, trays that are made from plastic. However, you will still be allowed to supply these products if you are supplying them to another business or the items are being used as packaging, for example, if they are pre-filled or filled at the point of sale. The ban will also cover ready-to-consume food and drinks in polystyrene containers, unless the food or drink requires further preparation before being consumed, for example, if it needs to be microwaved by the customer. Single-use plastic cutlery and balloon sticks will also be banned under the coming regulations, and there are no exemptions for these items. To prepare for these regulations, It is recommended that businesses use up any existing stock before the ban comes into force on the 1st of October this year, that they find reusable alternatives that can replace the soon-to-be banned items, or they find single-use items made from materials other than plastic, for example, disposable wooden cutlery. Next, we will have a look at a consultation related to REACH. The HSE has received several applications to authorise chromium trioxide under UK REACH. These applications are around its use in the surface treatment, electroplating and coating of engineering components. There are currently 3 separate consultations published by the Health and Safety Executive on this topic. And lastly, we have a recently announced change to the use of CE markings for business. Manufacturers, importers and distributors of certain types of products across the EU are required to ensure that those products have been conformity assessed and CE marked before those products are placed on the market. Until the 1st of January 2021, the same requirements applied to those operating in the UK. The UKCA mark was introduced after the United Kingdom left the EU and performs the same functions as the CE mark. Since the 1st of April 2021, goods placed on the UK market can be either CE marked or UKCA marked. Initially, the UK government intended to require goods placed on the UK market to be UKCA marked, removing the requirements for the CE marking entirely. This removal of CE marking was first pushed back to 2023 and then pushed back again to 2024 over concerns voiced by business. The government has now announced that the acceptance of CE marking in the UK market has been extended indefinitely. This means that products placed on the UK market can be either CE marked or UKCA marked until it is stated otherwise. And lastly, just a quick word on what services the compliance people can offer that you might be interested in. We can help you with legal compliance auditing for environmental and health and safety compliance obligations, management system support for ISO 14001, 45001 and 9001, and we provide a number of virtual training courses, including around waste duty of care and environmental aspects registers, risk assessments, environmental awareness, and introductions to ISO 14001 coming in the near future. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope you found this webinar useful. Thank you.